In today's video, we're looking to answer a question. Is there such a thing as a cheap F1 car? These were the F1 cars that got us freaking out as kids. F1 machines from an era when they were still incredibly good looking, an okay size, and powered by the greatest sounding engines ever. These things were the peak of naturally aspirated engineering, but because of that, they are ferociously expensive to run as a private owner nowadays. But is there another way? Is it possible to run a 90s, 2000s car on a relatively cheap budget? Well, we're here at TDF to speak to the experts to find out what's possible. TDF is a company based in Bedford that specialises in the running and maintaining of F1 cars from a variety of years, as well as creating their own track weapons, which we'll get to in a bit. The level these guys operate at is quite staggering for a relatively small company, and they are perfectly placed to answer any of my silly questions about this proposition. The reason I'm here to ask that question is because there could be the opportunity for some fairly extensive 2000s F1 car content on the channel this year. Do you remember that Jaguar R3 that we showed during Project Jag just a couple of videos ago? Well, the owner of that car has said that he's up for getting it running again and has tasked us with coming up with a plan as to how to get that car back out on the race circuits of the world using whatever methods possible. The dream situation is that we run the Jag on its original mechanicals, kind of like this BAR Honda here, although this isn't quite correct because this is an original factory Cosworth 3-litre V10. This is the engine that our Jaguar R3 originally ran on. So the dream situation would be to get this V10 in it, the original paddle shift transmission, the carbon brakes, the carbon suspension, but very quickly the numbers escalate into the millions. Also, you need an entire team of engineers to run the car, and they need to have all the correct computers just to start it up. The next obvious step down is to use an engine and drivetrain from our friends at Judd, because they produce what could be classed as a more usable F1 engine. That is because the service intervals on a Judd are roughly 3,000 kilometers versus these, which you have to rebuild every 400 kilometers. But it's still all relative. You're exchanging millions of pounds for many, many hundreds of thousands of pounds for something that will still be a fairly fragile piece of kit. So it's still a very, very scary and expensive proposition. If we're to make this F1 dream happen, it's fair to say we're going to need some pretty serious sponsors. So I'd like to kick things off with today's video sponsor, CarVertical. You could say, if we manage to pass this off, we're going to be seriously upping our Jag game, going from an XKR to an F1 car. But let's say you want to be a bit more sensible and go for something like an F-Type, and you come across this one on the internet. It has an MOT, it's a V8, it's the all-wheel drive version. These things are proper weapons. It looks all good, but this is where a CarVertical report comes in and can seriously save your skin in more ways than one. By putting this F-Type's reg or VIN number into CarVertical, it will give you this report, and immediately you can see there's an issue in the accident section, that little amber bit there. Has this car had a little shunt? Well, let's scroll down through the report. The data says it's a 2015-16 car. It had a reg change last year. It's quite low mileage, estimated at just 12,000, but then you hit the damage section, and the report says there was an issue in 2019. Skip to the photos, and it quickly unravels what that issue was. This F-Type was involved in a huge front end shunt, and then has been fixed and put back on the road. That looks like a huge frontal impact. You'd have to be Matt Armstrong to look at that car and think, oh, I fancy that. I imagine many of you would not want to buy a car knowing it had been in that big a crash and then had been fixed and MOT'd and was back on the roads. So to avoid buying a car with a dodgy past, click our exclusive link in the description below to get 10% off when using CarVertical. And again, a massive thank you to them for sponsoring today's video. before we get back to the F1 cars, how nice is this XKR? It's come from our friends at Swallows. I want it. Okay, back to the F1. So, with all of that in mind, I think I've come up with a solution to get the Jag moving and sounding good, but on a much, much smaller budget. Here's my plan. First up, the engine. I think it has to be as high revving as possible, which inevitably means motorcycle. I imagine the engine most people would jump to would be a Hayabusa, but that being an inline-4 engine, I simply don't think it'll sound right. So my choice is Ducati's V4 engine. It'll rev to 16,500 RPM, which isn't far away from what that V10 revved to back in the day, and is actually more than some of these cars run nowadays to keep them safe. Also, being in a V configuration, the sound will match much better than an inline-4 would. Power won't be huge, probably between 200 and 250 horsepower, but I can guarantee it will still feel quick in a car as light as these things. After that, we can then keep stealing bike components to start building up the car, like an ECU, the radiator for cooling, the matching transmission. The only thing that's irking me so far is how we're going to drive the rear wheels. If we keep the bike set up, it would be a nice big rear sprocket to turn the rear wheels. But a chain-driven F1 car just doesn't sound right to me. And also, we may need to modify the rear bodywork of the Jag to make that sprocket fit, which could get a bit messy. But on our budget, that may be the only solution. In terms of suspension, the owner does have the original carbon fiber arms from the Jaguar back in 2002, but they're so fragile, and if we were to ever damage one, we couldn't afford to fix it. So the solution there is to make identical suspension arms using steel. And what's interesting about this Jordan Peugeot is it had a mishmash of both from factory. So we've got carbon fiber on the upper arms and steel on the lower. Our ones will look a lot like those. For the uprights, brakes, wheels and tyres, I think I'd just come down the formulas probably to Formula 3, although the amount of power we're going to be producing, we may even be able to come down to Formula 4, but we'd scope things out safety-wise and see what would work. The final thing is finding a steering wheel. And the big decision there is what we do with the clutch. Do we go with a hand clutch like the Jag originally had, or do we go for a third pedal, both of which would be cable operated? So that's my extremely simplistic breakdown of how I would go about getting a Jaguar Formula 1 car back up and moving in a sensible way. The goal, of course, isn't to match the performance of the original machine, more just to get it moving again in a respectable way that would mean people could enjoy that epic livery once more. The rough cost of all of those parts is about 30 grand, but the way that YouTube works, we would create deals with numerous partners and manufacturers to reduce that cost significantly in exchange for the exposure they'll be getting. Almost every car in here either has its factory engine or the Judd equivalent, but this car is TDF's approach to answering the exact same question that we are asking, albeit with a much, much higher budget than we're operating on. This is what they call the TDF1, and it started life as a Marussia F1 car from the V8 era. They've then brought it here and stripped away all the highly strung, expensive technology and have started replacing it with much more mundane stuff to make it a reliable, cheap to run F1 car. Out goes the highly strung Cosworth V8 and in goes this. It's a single turbo 4-cylinder engine developed by Mountune. It puts out between 450 and 600 horsepower depending on how spicy you want your TDF1 to be. This is combined with the original Aero and Pirelli slick tyres to give you what TDF says is 90% of the Formula 1 experience. But again, it's all relative. You still have to be a multi-millionaire to own one of these as a weekend track toy. My plan is substantially different to the world that the guys at TDF operate in. So let's chat to James, the Chief Technical Director here, to see what he thinks of my strategy. James, thank you for having us at this amazing facility. I've given you my plan, you've had a read over it. How does it look? Am I barking up the wrong tree with this thing?
Well, firstly, thanks for coming. It's an interesting proposition, something quite different to what we do.
Yes.
It's definitely doable. It'd be interesting to see what people think about it.
Okay.
But yeah, it certainly could be quite an interesting spin.
Okay. And having looked down my list, are there any serious red flags, be it the engine, the suspension, cooling? Is there anything that sticks out to you being like, that's going to be an issue?
There's a few.
Okay.
But I think they're all workarounds. You know, you can work around everything.
Yeah.
I think for us, the big ones would be if you wanted to change from the carbon wishbones to a steel wishbone. I think for us, we would always stay as the car was, even if we had to remake new. For things, should you get into the worst situation.
Yeah.
They won't try and punch their way through the chassis because of the way the bulkheads are.
Okay.
But
so
I think
steel would be an issue in that case. Steel could come through.
yeah, potentially. Obviously, it was always designed with all the F1 whiz that the carbon wishbones would break.
Okay,
as
cool.
they should.
Cool.
I think the rest of it is all just how you work around it. Things like brakes, you'd always be, all the safety items for us are always quite high on the list. So I think provided you get a decent workaround for those, they could be okay.
Okay, and the main thing that's pissing me off a bit is having a chain-driven sprocket at the back. That just seems off to me, but I imagine if you try and put a proper gearbox and diff at the back, suddenly that expense is just going to go crazy, or is there a potential workaround there?
Yeah, I mean, there might be something out there that kind of does that already, because other people obviously do similar conversions in other cars, but it's probably going to be quite big.
Okay.
Yeah, cost is definitely going to go up. The easiest, quickest way to get it moving will be a nice kart-style rear axle with a chain drive.
Okay, and is even thinking about modifying that original Jaguar tub, is that even something we can approach, or should we do everything we can to not touch that tub at all?
I think for what you're going to do in the rear, I think you can do it without having to touch anything that's original.
Okay.
With a nice frame in the back. It's not something we've particularly done lots of because we try and obviously keep them like this, but I think the least you can attach or touch what is originally there, the better.
Okay, cool. Well, if it's okay with you, I think myself and the guys from Swallows will go away, we'll have a go, and then I imagine I'll need to come knocking for some advice and maybe some bespoke parts to get us going. Is that a potential option?
We'll be on the end of the phone. Just give it a shout.
Cool. Thank you very much.
I imagine there may be a bit of a split camp on this one, with some of you saying to just go for it and get that stunning car going again, and others saying if you're not going to do it properly, don't do it. So you would want the original hardware put back in the car or nothing. I personally think it's a crime that a car as good looking as that O2 Jaguar is just sitting in a garage doing nothing. I think we should get that car moving no matter what the powertrain and no matter how much budget goes into it, as long as it's safe. But I would like to hear from you guys. Tell me in the comments below what you would do. Would you just tweak parts of my plan, or would you fundamentally change it? Let me know down below. Today has been all about a fact-finding mission to take information in from TDF and to hear from you guys as to what we should do. So hopefully in future we'll come up with a really solid plan, and who knows where it could go from there. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. I've been Mike, and don't forget to subscribe to DRIVETRIBE.